afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, welcome to this webinar on foreign information operations targeting California and other states. It's a real pleasure to have all of you with us today. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and I think you're in for a treat today with a very interesting discussion. You know, here in California, and I know some of you are here in the area, and many of you are from all around the United States. So you may not be aware of how devastating the fires that we had in Pacific Palisades and the Eaton fires earlier this year were, as well as just recently the immigration protests that we had. And they were sufficiently concerning in terms of the fires and the protests and those sorts of things, without knowing that we had international actors, foreign actors who were targeting us and manipulating information or misinformation to leverage that and cause issues. And that's really what we'll be talking about today with Brett Schaefer from the German Marshall Fund and Dr. Robert English, professor from USC. So it should be a very interesting discussion. The format for today's discussion, Brett will take about 10 minutes to talk just about this topic. Then there'll be a moderated discussion moderated by Dr. English with he and Brett. And then there'll be about 30 minutes of questions from you. And so what we'd like to do is have you all be part of that conversation. And the way you can do that is to go down to the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. And at any time throughout this webinar, you can type in your question. And then during that session, Krista Seitz, who will be running the Q&A, will respond. We'll pass those to Dr. English and get your questions to Brett. So at any time, please feel free to ask a question. And let me just say also, before I introduce Dr. English, tomorrow we have a very interesting, the Los Angeles World Affairs Council has a very interesting panel on artificial intelligence. And it'll be at UCLA at the UCLA Faculty Center tomorrow at 6 o'clock. It's a dinner event. But I encourage, if you're interested at all in AI and threats and opportunities, this is one not to miss. We had this event actually for our high school program last month, and it was so good. I mean, everyone, to include the panelists, were all just said, wow, we have to do this again. And so we're reprising this event tomorrow evening at 6. So if you're interested at all, please, we'll have the, you can register in the chat box there. If you go there, you'll see a link. And if you're interested, please register. But now let me introduce Dr. Robert English, who, as I mentioned, is a professor at University of Southern California. He was previously the director of the School of International Relations there. And currently, he's the director of Central European Studies there at USC. He's been a professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's been an analyst at the Department of Defense and the Citizens for National Security. He's also published widely books as well as articles in very distinguished journals. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. English with us today as moderator. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. English to introduce Brett and moderate the event. Thank you, Dr. English.
Oh, glad to be here, and thanks for the warm introduction. And let me go right to Brett Schaefer, the star of the show, and continue the introductions. Brett is best known as a former professional baseball player in Germany and my graduate student. But what you want to know, those are true facts, and we'll probably come back to that, is that he is currently a senior fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy of the German Marshall Fund. That's the basis of the work that's so interesting today. He's an expert in digital and computational propaganda, state-backed information operations, technology regulation, and much more. And he's the creator and manager of the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, which is an online open source tool for tracking the propaganda, the influence operations of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian state media outlets, diplomats, and government officials. So it's an important resource. Brett has presented his work. He's in conferences, in briefings to international organizations, to governments all over the world. And his research has been cited in all the big places, right? New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, as well as the major broadcast media like CNN, NBC, and so on. Before he joined the Alliance for Securing Democracy, I guess he made his bones, as they say, in the media world, both as, I guess, a producer at various networks, Warner Brothers, Cartoon Network. He worked in Budapest, Hungary as a radio host, and much else. So he's seen it from inside and out, and now he's an analyst on the basis of all that experience. And yes, he was a graduate student of mine. He holds a master's degree in public diplomacy from USC, and before that, a BA in communications, focused on radio, television, broadcast journalism from the national leading journalism school at Northwestern University. So Brett, very pleased that you're back, and I can catch up on what you're doing, because what you're doing is really important. So please take it away and talk about the Alliance for Securing Democracy and foreign influence operations against the US and against our California.
Well, thanks, Dr. English. And I wish I was back in California today, especially on a day when it's triple digits here in DC. So it's a little bit toasty here. So I'm going to just share my screen here and walk us through a slideshow presentation, which hopefully this will work. And you should be seeing that now. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today is based on a report I co-authored with one of my colleagues back in February that looked at the state of foreign information operations from a state-by-state perspective. So we had a case from all 50 states and the District of Columbia where a foreign malign actor ran an influence campaign that either targeted an issue within that state or used certain actors within that state to help propagate an information campaign. But that report, of course, was published in February, which means we didn't actually cover in the report the most recent ICE protests that were mentioned at the start. So I wanted to start there and actually go through what we've seen in the past couple of weeks here. So these are some posts on X, formerly Twitter, from Sputnik, which is one of Russia's main media outlets. And so you had a couple conspiracy theories that Sputnik was helping to sort of gin up. One, that the protests were all sort of driven by Soros-linked networks that would say planned sort of left-wing operation. And then we had this other conspiracy theory that there were certain activists that were leaving pallets of bricks around the protest sites, and that these bricks, of course, were being used by rioters to throw at police officers, etc. So we've seen this pallet of bricks narrative before, and one of the things you might notice there, if you are actually a Los Angelino, is that doesn't actually look like Los Angeles. So when I saw this immediately, I knew something was a little up here, because that certainly is not downtown LA, and that doesn't look like anywhere I've been in California. And in fact, it's not. So open source intelligence analysts were able to track that location to West New York, New Jersey. And so what you have here is a classic case where you have a real picture. This isn't artificially generated, taken out of context and put into an influence campaign to make it seem like something that happened in the past or something that happened in a different location is actually being perpetrated in the present. So this is sort of a classic technique. What makes this challenging from a perspective of foreign information operations is all of this actually started from domestic players. So the actor James Woods, very active on Twitter, sort of a right-wing commentator. He is the one who first posted this sort of pallet of brick story. It showed up on Newsmax. Newsmax also ran this idea that the protests were being organized at some level by Soros-linked networks. And then the next day, Sputnik runs with it. So that's what we often see in these foreign information operations, particularly around domestic issues. They are very good at picking and choosing domestic narratives, sort of formulating them into their own style, especially to advance specific geopolitical agendas and making it their own. But it does make it difficult to draw that very clear line between what is a foreign influence campaign and what is domestic. But what we also saw around the protests, and this is actually more typical when we look at the sort of geopolitical environment, is actors from China, from Iran, and even Russian outlets that were using the protests to try to make the Trump administration or try to make the US government look bad, to make them look hypocritical. So we saw a lot of posts around double standards, that the US response to protesters in Taiwan and Hong Kong is very different to the response to protesters at home. On the right there, you have a post from Russia's Spanish language outlet, where that is an AI-generated image. So that's Maria Zakharova, who's the spokeswoman for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's purportedly showing her handing out biscuits or cookies to the protesters or rioters in California. If you know a little bit about Russian modern history, this is a reference to Victoria Nuland, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State, passing out biscuits to some of the protesters at the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. So they were trolling us, and this is quite typical. So before we dive back into the presentation and what we've seen at the state-by-state level, I did just want to take a moment to go over the terms, because often these terms are used interchangeably and they're used incorrectly. And this has created some of the backlash against those of us actually working in this field, because we see things that are conflated. So misinformation is just people who are wrong. If you have relatives on Facebook, you have encountered misinformation more than likely. Disinformation is when there's specific intent behind the false narratives, and intent to create some sort of reaction or response, or to create some sort of change. Malinformation exists in the same world as disinformation, except for the fact the information is technically true. So an example of this would be, I could run a story every single day in California saying dozens of people died yesterday after drinking tap water. That would be technically true, but of course wildly misleading. So we see a lot of this in the foreign malign influence space, where there are bits of truth, but they're taken out of context or with misleading context and used in the same way that disinformation is used. We tend to use the catch-all term of information operations, just because that covers not just the veracity of the piece of content, but also the behavior being used by the foreign actors. So somebody presenting themselves, somebody in St. Petersburg, Russia, presenting themselves as a Black activist in Los Angeles, they might be posting entirely true content, but it would still be part of the influence operation or the information operation. And then the last two, FIMI and FMI, they're basically the same things. The Europeans use the acronym FIMI, so that's Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference. And the US uses Foreign Malign Influence, but they're effectively the same thing. So what are the objectives of information operations? So first of all, we look at economic interest, and we've seen a lot of these attacks targeting state and local businesses. So this is a case of a rare earth company in Oklahoma and Texas called Linus that was attacked as part of a PRC influence campaign to try to gin up sort of environmental protests around the expansion of Linus's operations throughout the US. This, of course, is because the Chinese kind of have cornered the market around rare earth materials, and so they wanted to impede the progress of a competitor. We've seen this happen quite often. We saw this with the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, where Russian influence campaigns were trying to lean into the environmental protests there. We saw it with the rollout of 5G. So when 5G rolled out across the US, RT America ran stories almost every day documenting the supposed health risks, that it was going to create the radioactive cloud, that it was going to affect weather patterns, that it would cause cancer, all of these different things. Meanwhile, Russia was trying to roll out 5G of its own. So then a second potential opportunity from information operations is a classic one, to smear opponents. So back in September of last year, Alabama Republican Congressman Barry Moore supported a bill to try to make it more difficult for the Chinese to buy American farmland. A month later, threat detectors working at Microsoft found a Chinese disinformation operation targeting Representative Moore, saying that he was corrupt, etc. So very much a cause and effect here. You go against the issues that these certain countries care about. Targeted campaigns try to smear those opponents. Then this is a classic one for the Russians, divide and polarize. This has probably been the best covered over the last 10 years of Russia's primary goals of running influence operations in the United States. My guess would be, once we get some data back from the recent protests, we will find Chinese or probably Russian trolls on both the left and the right of the recent ICE protests, tried to embed themselves in those conversations. One of the classic cases was back in 2015, 2016, when there was evidence that the Russian Information Research Agency had set up Facebook groups to try to get protesters on both sides of a debate to turn up outside of an Islamic center in Houston, Texas. They were actually successful in doing that. So you had these sort of anti-Islamic protesters and those attempting to defend them, both being pushed by Russian trolls to the same street at the same time, obviously in the hopes of creating some sort of real-world violence. Then, of course, there is the effort to erode trust in government. Now, often this is to erode trust in the federal government, but we also see this at the state and local level. So the California example, of course, after the wildfires earlier this year, we saw Russian influence campaigns effectively trying to say that the reason that the fires were not able to be contained is because the LA fire departments had given much of their equipment to the Ukrainians, or that the US government had prioritized funding efforts in Ukraine over funding efforts to fight fires or other activities at home. So this is fairly common after natural disasters. We saw this in North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. We saw this after train derailments in Kentucky and Ohio. Depending on which foreign actor is involved, they often sort of recalibrate the narratives to fit their own geopolitical agenda. So if it's China, of course, they're saying the US doesn't have money to do this kind of activity because they're supporting Taiwan. If it's the Iranians, it's because of support for Israel. The Russians, it's because of support for Ukraine. So it's a fairly common thread. Now, I did want to talk about one tactic that is particularly pervasive and we find to be particularly problematic, because every example I've given so far has come from an overt source. So we know the source of information. These are documented state media accounts. These are people affiliated with those accounts or diplomats. What we see foreign actors and adversaries often doing is trying to launder their information into domestic sources, legitimate or otherwise. So one of the first examples of this we caught, it was very crude. This is probably back in 2018, 2019. There was a Twitter account called Fort Lauderdale Eats. It was pretty much what it sounds like. It gave you tips on happy hours, sort of 2-for-1 deals. All of a sudden one day, it flipped over to pushing out Chinese propaganda. Now, this is pretty obvious. I don't think anyone who was following this to figure out what was the special of the day at TGI Fridays was all of a sudden confused about what had happened here. But the reason that the Chinese and others do this is, of course, it is harder for the platforms, the tech companies, to take down accounts that seem to be run by legitimate Americans. Since that time, they have become more sophisticated. So these are two efforts that we saw during last election cycle. One, taking advantage of the gig economy. There was a Russian influence agent, he actually lives in Australia, but has connections to the Russian intelligence services, who was paying Americans $100 a post to post fake videos around social media. Again, the reason is real Americans have real American friends. They also have First Amendment rights, and the platforms are less likely to take down their content than if it was posted by an anonymous troll. The other case here is the case of Tenet Media. So Tenet Media was a Tennessee-based production company that it was found had spent about $10 million to bring over 6 of the biggest podcasters on the political right. So these are people with million-plus viewership on YouTube, on other social media channels. The entire network was being paid for by Russian state media covertly. So these podcasters were unwitting. They were unaware of where the money was coming from. The people running the network certainly knew. But here you have Americans who have huge followings, basically in the employment, unknowingly, of a Russian state media operation. We also saw efforts to run actual disinformation campaigns through faux local news outlets. So KBSF is not a real San Francisco news outlet, but this is where we saw the story posted that claimed Kamala Harris, when she was a candidate last year, had hit a 13-year-old girl in a hit-and-run accident, left her paralyzed, and then fled the scene. I mean, this was entirely invented and made up. That's an actor there on the right. All of this was being run by a former Florida sheriff deputy named John Mark Dugan, who now lives in Moscow and runs this wide disinformation network. often pushing his content through these faux local news outlets that appear to be authentic American news outlets. So here's one of those. This is the Los Angeles Herald, and this is an article that was published yesterday about Hollywood seeding Iran war narratives for years, which came through WikiLeaks. If you look closely there, you'll see the byline is actually from RT.com, which is, of course, Russian state media. So here you have what appears to be a local news outlet running Russian, oftentimes Chinese propaganda. They are at least semi-transparent. I mean, you can see the byline there, but it is, of course, not entirely clear to most people if they were reading this that this is not coming from a local news outlet. And now to sort of look at the ways in which AI, and I know this is the topic of conversation in the event tomorrow, is being used to launder information. So we found this article a few years ago. Article itself doesn't really matter. This is just a Russian state media article that talked about the classified documents found in former President Biden's house. So we wanted to know where else this article was appearing. And so we found it after running a Google search on a place called Little Rock AR News. And it seems to be the exact same title, but this one is attributed to seemingly an American author named Judy Allen. Now, our first clue that there was something up with Judy Allen is she had published approximately 450 articles that morning, which is prolific even in the digital publishing environment. And also, we couldn't find any evidence that Judy Allen existed. And in fact, that is an AI-generated image. So that person there is entirely fictional. We then looked where else we could find that article, and we found the same thing on something called Albuquerque Breaking News. You see the layout is more or less identical, but here, this one is published seemingly by Jacqueline Aguilera. Again, this person does not exist. That's AI generated. And what we found is that they were swapping out synonyms throughout the articles. The reason they do that is so that Google, in the search results, will read it as being an original or unique piece of content. And so they're changing about 30% of the articles around. Sometimes it was unnoticeable, like they changed round to round. Sometimes it was quite clear. Classified materials got changed to delicate supplies. So once we found that pattern, we found approximately 150 of these fake local news outlets that were part of this one single network. As you see, that includes another fictional Los Angeles outlet there. And the reason that they're doing this is not necessarily because they're going to drive a ton of readership to these individual sites. What that is helping to do is game AI models. So if you know about how AI models work, these large language models, they are sucking in an enormous amount of content so that chatbots are able to spit back out answers to your prompts. And what researchers have found is this massive spamming campaign from the Russians has started to influence what chatbots, what AI tools are spitting back to people who enter prompts, especially if it is a question that relates to issues that Russia really cares about. So you're having Russia start to poison some of these AI models. And so I will stop there and turn it back over to Dr. English to answer your question.
Well, that was fantastic, Brett. Thanks for the concise and sweeping overview, because there's so much contained in there. We could go on for hours, but we only have a short time, and then it goes to the public. Probably have better questions than me, so I'll be right to the point. How do you measure the impact? And I assume it's growing, because some of the things we see, they don't seem very credible. RT, Sputnik, when they themselves, they might still be on some American cable channels, I don't know, or maybe some journalists pick up and use their material, but it seems that's pretty limited. As I recall correctly, after the 2016 election and this first big round of Russian interference in a presidential election, a lot of those networks were dropped by responsible cable providers. So it would seem that that was a blow against it. But now you've given us all the way to the AI of today, or using, getting something laundered, as you say, to get it in, even though it's false or misinformation, it then appears legitimate. And then some of these are people who would be posting extremist stuff anyway. I think what I understood from Tenant Media is they kept doing their thing, but by financing it, Russia was giving them a megaphone or magnifying their voice. So these are all a little different, but they're all pointing in a negative direction. How do you assess how bad it's got in terms of affecting local politics or having a major impact on some election, or maybe just the divisiveness in US politics today?
The answer to that question is the answer I've always given, is basically a shrug. I don't know. On in any individual case, I would not be able to say that the reason that the commentary around the NFL protests became more divisive was because the Russians leaned into it. I don't know. But one of the things we know from influence, and there are a couple cases I can cite on this, is all it needs is to be picked up by one credible, influential voice. So the way that we often try to measure the impact is by looking at metrics, like how many people viewed it, what was the reach, all of the social media metrics we can see. To your point, I think that's often misleading, because a Russian article could get a ton of traction, but it's effectively just mirroring what's in the US ecosystem. And so it's irrelevant. Other times we've seen specific narratives that have seemingly died in the wild. They got no traction originally, but 6 months later, they pop up because somebody influential, whether they were influenced by the Russians or not, starts talking about it, and it becomes a big thing. I mean, the first Trump impeachment scandal could be traced back to this narrative because it was something that Trump brought up with Zelensky that was posted on this far-flung blog. The blog shut down. The original story got no traction. Somehow that got in front of President Trump. And so, of course, if you're looking at the influence there, obviously outsized, I mean, created a major scandal. There's no way for us to track that. So I don't know. The other thing, though, is we shouldn't look at this just from a US prism. I think Russian state media's influence in the US is very limited, to your point. Even at its height, it didn't get a ton of traction. On YouTube, it had a pretty big footprint. It's now gone from there, but it never had the kind of following that it has in other parts of the world. In Latin America, and so Spanish-speaking world, RT in Espanol outperforms CNN in Espanol. It outperforms BBC Mundo when you look at Facebook numbers, if you look at Twitter. And so, in just talking to people on the ground there, their sense is it is seen as just a credible major international broadcaster. So I think it differs depending on where you are in the world. But oftentimes, look, they're trying to move things 1 or 2 degrees. I don't think you see people's attitudes flip entirely because of an influence campaign. They're trying to work the margins. And if you're looking at an election, they're trying to work that 1 or 2%. This is why they target swing states. I mean, they're just like advertisers. They know they're not going to change 250 million people's minds. They're trying to get that 1 or 2% that can create whatever outcome that they're after.
Thanks for going abroad, because my next question is about a foreign case. And again, maybe it shows where we'll be headed someday, and someday not too distant. It's the case of the massive TikTok influencing campaign in Romania. Maybe some of our listeners recall that back in late November, early December, there was a scandal around the first round of the presidential election in Romania. And with just a few days to go before the second round, the Federal Election Commission, the courts in Romania together stepped in and annulled that first round election because they had detected what seemed to be a concerted, well-financed campaign on TikTok in particular that shot this fairly obscure politician into the lead in a matter of weeks. There was a lot of controversy about that. They held the election in May, a second round. And curiously, both first round leaders lost. And in fact, this is my point, that a lot of people thought that was going too far. The liberal candidate herself, the one who'd been neck and neck with the Russian-backed candidate in the first round, protested the annulment. And she said, it's going to hurt me too. And it did. Some other, liberal pro-Western observers said the same thing. This might be an overreaction because now it appears you're giving the Russians or you're giving the hard right wing even more fuel by actually canceling an election. And then you had just sort of opinion polling among ordinary Romanians that showed, they said, well, yeah, we know that's going on, but it's going on all over the place, left and right. Don't you think we can make up our own minds? Why are you treating us like children and canceling our election? Our votes were still valid, but you're assuming that we were like children and couldn't make up our minds. So they were between a rock and a hard place. And it was a very difficult call to make. And two different candidates competed in the second go around on this election, and the more moderate one won, although not with a huge margin. And it's not clear what this will leave, the sour taste in Romanian society and neighboring Balkan countries. So could we be headed in that direction if it gets bad enough? Maybe not national officials, but local election officials might step in. Do we have a coordinated policy? Are people thinking about what we should do if it gets that bad, so we don't fumble?
Yeah, I think that set a bad precedent. And we have Romanian colleagues who have argued that there was also sort of campaign finance violations there. There's some other things going around. But regardless, the major narrative was the election was effectively canceled because they detected a Russian influence campaign that leaned in the favor of one candidate. I think that is extraordinarily problematic because, you of course know this concept of the Soviet reflexive control, effectively getting the adversary to do something against their will. And so the other option for the Russians, as they've seen this play out, is you put your fingerprints on the campaign you actually want to damage. And so in the future, and not just an election, we could see that around a protest movement, for example. If you want to discredit an individual, if you want to discredit a protest movement, you make it obvious that you have run an influence campaign in their favor. That could be used to discredit them. We've seen that before. So I think that was a fumble. That was extraordinarily problematic. You of course saw J.D. Vance hammer the Europeans about that in his speech at Munich. And so I hope the lesson we've learned from that is we can't take it that far. I mean, there is a possibility for Russian interference to be at a level where you might have to worry about the results of an election in terms of actually hacking into systems. But of course, that's not what happened here. If we're talking about just an influence campaign, I think we can't look at that as being an option because I agree, whether it actually influenced people or not, that incentivizes the Russians to continue with a variety of really bad behaviors because, of course, it creates an outcome where they win either way because you've then sort of discredited the system, everything we know Russia tries to achieve through influence operations.
Let me turn it back to this country, because fortunately, our political system, the media surrounding them, haven't got as corrupt, as shaky, as dodgy as in some of these poor countries. We still have responsible mainstream media, broadsheet newspapers, and a lot of our social media consumers are able to balance these things. But we are going in that direction. So that's really my question, whether it's cyber hygiene, whether it's critical thinking. We've heard examples, for example, Finland, other EU countries who have made a point, not just of doing what you're doing and funding it better. And I assume you could use more funding and would like to see efforts like yours and colleagues doing similar things, stop fakes, exposing, expand it. But what about also better educating the public? Is that hopeless? Is it something we can do in high school? How can we, better train our media consumers to be aware and to see when they're being manipulated?
Well, it's something we can and should do in high school, but we should also start earlier. I mean, the Finnish model, the Baltics, they start that in primary school, and it is part of their academic curriculum throughout. And so it's drilled into them really as part of their entire educational curriculum. And so it's not presented as, here's your media literacy class, and you're going to go sit somewhere for a couple hours, and you're going to come out the other side being more media literate. It is embedded in everything that they do. So I think we should be doing that. And I also think we should be looking at this as being less about media literacy, which we need, but also digital literacy, understanding how information systems work. Because a lot of our work is not looking at the veracity of a piece of content. It's looking at how an information system can be exploited or attacked. So we know that we're shown certain articles because of trending algorithms. So we look at ways that bad actors can exploit the information, the digital ecosystem. And I think understanding, for example, especially with the AI, when you enter a prompt into AI, there isn't some wizard behind a curtain like a librarian that's going to serve you back the best response because somebody has critically looked at your prompt and gone through that kind of evaluation that you would expect from a historian, for example. It is being spit back based on the amount of data that it has been trained on. So, for example, if you ask a Chinese AI model, Chinese chatbot, about Tiananmen Square, the protest in '89 didn't happen. And so I think we need a better understanding of the digital information ecosystem. And that obviously goes beyond school age kids and maybe is needed more for generations who are out of school, who didn't grow up in the digital media ecosystem. And so there's some harder to reach populations that we need to think about getting digital literacy training in front of as well, because of course, this is the major voting population too.
It's hard to be optimistic at this point in our political life. Maybe this will turn in a few years. But speaking as a college teacher, so I get new students every year. And in a very short space of time, I remember maybe 5-7 years ago, I teaching classes about Russia, world affairs, war and peace. I would quickly learn if they remembered the Cold War, if they remembered this or that, if they had a sense of these grand movements in geopolitics. And it changed every year. And then it began being not just Fox News or more niche stuff, but social media. And I could see, I mean, literally at the start of the Ukraine war, Zelensky was a hero. What Putin did was just war crime, aggression. It was just clear as black and white. And whether it was right-wing Republicans, Tucker Carlson, whether it was presidential candidate and then President Trump himself, whether it was these Russian efforts, whatever came together, suddenly in the space of a couple of years, I had a surprising number of students who, well, Russia's not so bad and Ukraine's so corrupt, and it just changed in a blink of an eye. That didn't happen through mainstream media. So I know whether it's TikTok, Instagram, whatever they're reading, it's powerful, and it doesn't, make me optimistic that we're really winning that digital literacy battle. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we're definitely not. I mean, my interest in this topic started when I was at USC and when I was a TA for undergrad classes. And there were several who were turning in international relations papers. And this is back in 2015, I guess, maybe 2016. So RT was not known the way it is now because they had not been outed as part of the interference in the 2016 election. So there's just not a very good understanding that RT was connected to Russia. And I was seeing a lot of undergraduate papers that were citing RT on YouTube for IR papers, often having nothing to do with Russia. And so I asked some of those students, why did you cite RT in this paper about Hungarian nuclear proliferation or something? And the answer was always the same. That's what showed up first when I ran a search. So this is how Russia understood how to game the system early. They knew how to get their content in front of people. But at least then, somebody who was media literate could see that it was coming from RT. And I could see it in the paper. Now with these AI models, you have no idea what's being fed into the system. So I'm guessing a lot of your students now are going to ChatGPT for answers to those questions. And they wouldn't even get a sense that that answer is being influenced by RT and Sputnik and all of the faux local outlets that they're pushing out their content to. So that is even a more dangerous situation because you have no real understanding of the underlying sources that are being fed into these systems that can completely change people's perceptions on world events and historical narratives too. I mean, we think about the present day, but we know Russia cares a lot about historical memory, China too. And the ability to go back and rewrite history by flooding the information space with their version of events is something I'm very concerned about.
Last question before we go to the public, a short one. You've mentioned AI as a tool in the ways in which it can get this stuff out there and conceal its origins. What about the quality of the content itself? One of the red flags was just bad writing. These guys at the IRA, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, writing their messages, just bad grammar, clearly Slavic, this and that, notoriously like laughable, or whether you're reading the comments on a Washington Post article, bot alert. is AI helping them sound more genuine?
100%.
It's being
Yeah,
used for
100%. That tell is gone. So when I started this work again, I would find accounts that were suspicious often because of that. I mean, you're a Russian speaker, you know, Russians struggle with articles. So you often saw problems with articles in the posts from the Internet Research Agency. That does not exist anymore. So all they need to do is run things through ChatGPT. They will frankly sound, their grammar will probably be better than most Americans. So we might be able to start catching some of these accounts because the grammar is too good. But that's the concern too. It's not just they sound like authentic Americans, they can sound like authentic Americans speaking in 30 or 40 different voices with very little effort. So what I mean by that is, you know, we know they had trolls that were presenting themselves as pro-Trump, Second Amendment conservatives. We know that they had Black Lives Matter accounts. They used to have separate teams doing that. Now you have one person who can take a narrative and say, write this in the voice of a Trump supporter, write this in the voice of a Black Lives Matter activist, write this in Spanish. And so it's allowed them to scale up their operations with very little cost. And again, yeah, the fluency of the English it's no longer an issue.
Yeah. I will turn now to taking some questions from our audience because there are some good ones and there'll be more. So I'll just put them right to you. So far, we've mainly been discussing adversary states. What are we doing, we and our allies doing back? Are we doing any of the same? And should we be, perhaps?
So it's a tough question. Whether we are running covert campaigns in other parts of the world using sock puppet accounts, presenting ourselves as being locals, that's something I wouldn't know about. Obviously, it's being done through the intelligence communities. I assume it's happening at some level, and there have been certain operations that have been caught. Frankly, every time those operations have been caught, beyond the fact, ethically, in most cases, I don't think we should be doing that. We also don't do it particularly well, and it tends to backfire. So one of the cases, there was a contractor for the DoD who was caught running a disinformation campaign in the Philippines, I think, to denigrate Chinese-made vaccines. So they were effectively trying to damage China by saying that their vaccine was not safe and don't take it. And this was, of course, just a sort of ridiculous campaign that was harming public health. And it was exactly what the Chinese and Russians were doing to us, trying to damage our vaccine. So that is an approach that I don't think is the one we want to take. Now, if we are going into Russia to try to get information in front of Russians so they understand what's really happening in Ukraine, and you've got to use some covert efforts there, like, I think that is morally acceptable, and we probably should be doing that. But in general, I mean, there's a sense that we're definitely not competing particularly well in the information space. We are certainly not spending to the same level, and that was even during the Biden years where this stuff was still prioritized. At this point, the Trump administration has effectively killed every effort to counter foreign propaganda. So there was, I guess, 5 different parts of the US government that were really tasked with this back in December. So you had the DOJ had a team, FBI had a team, you had the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, which then became what was called RFINI. You had at the Director of National Intelligence, the Foreign Malign Influence Center, and you had DHS CISA that had what's called their MDM team, Misdis Malinformation. The only one of those that still exists is the Foreign Malign Influence Center at ODNI, and that doesn't have any leadership, and it's kind of a ghost ship. So at present, we are not even really fighting the defensive battle, let alone the offensive one. Now, the Europeans are still engaged, and Europeans have supported civil society much more in our efforts to combat this. But still, if you look at the numbers, the playing field is not level when you look at the amount they're spending versus the amount we're spending in the information space.
Thanks for anticipating. I should, by the way, just highlight some of our viewers. The first question was from Yigal Arenz, and basically you anticipated a question from both Jim Grant and Joseph Leonard, but they included I mean, you've answered half the question, but they also wanted to know about VOA and I guess Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty as part of the legitimate open part of
Mhm.
influencing opinion abroad, which also now is pretty handicapped, if not basically kneecapped. What's your opinion about their importance and what damage is being done by ending their influence?
An enormous amount of damage, and something that we're not going to be able to turn around overnight. If a new administration comes in and they want to prioritize international broadcasting again, this will take decades to get back on their feet. In some cases, because we have actually lost the ability to be able to broadcast. So, having, I don't know, I'm throwing this out, but 93.7 in some part of the world where VOA used to be on radio, like they've given that up, it's gone. And then to get the credibility back will be maybe generational. So it's just hugely damaging. And, again, in some parts of the world, VOA is certainly not what it was. I mean, with its height during the Cold War, its ability to kind of influence conversations in Russia, it's maybe not as influential. In other parts of the world, VOA, Radio Free Europe, really was one of the few outlets that wasn't controlled by the government. And even some of the work that we did looking at Moldova before the recent elections, when we looked at Google results, just to very quickly go through the research project here, we ran a bunch of queries, maybe 100 queries that'd be relevant to the election every day for a few months, just to see the sources that showed up most often. And in Moldova, Radio Free Europe was the first and the second most visible outlets in search results. So it still has an outsized impact in parts of the world that we really care about. And now we've lost that. So again, it's a space that we know Russia and the Chinese are spending more money to fill that void. So I don't quite understand the move to completely end it. I mean, we knew during the first Trump administration that he had some problems with the BBG, then it became USAGM. But to get rid of it in its entirety, I think is a huge own goal.
A slightly different question, but a good one. Again, from Joseph Leonard. How will China use information warfare during a blockade or quarantine of Taiwan? And I might add on to that, or even a full-on military operation. What additional kinds of information warfare, disorientation, psyops, what might we expect to see? Because they've been practicing, right?
Yes, and I don't know the answer to that question. Partly because I'm more of a Russia person than a China person, and partly because we don't know what we don't know. But this again gets to why it seems so self-defeating that we've made the moves that we've made if we ever get into an actual confrontation with a global adversary. If we give up on the information space in a time of actual conflict where this doesn't become a battle of narratives, it becomes more life and death than that, we've ceded so much of the information ground to our adversaries that I think we're in trouble there. But my guess would be you're going to see more efforts to cut communication systems as well. So you would see an outage, for example, and we know the Russians have tried this, right? Cutting some undersea cables. And this is stuff I don't know particularly well. It's in a realm a little bit outside of my research. But to be able to sort of sever the internet at times, we know, of course, they tried to do this in Ukraine and have been relatively effective in some places. So I would look at that, but I would also then look at a complete blitz of our social media platforms where they have accounts that have built up followings and will just turn themselves on to sort of full blast. But my concern would be a more aggressive approach as well.
What can, again, another question, Chris Lawson, what resources would you suggest for fact checking for us, ordinary news consumers, when we see a story proliferating that we may have doubts about and want to follow up? Is there an easy way, a resource to check on the veracity, check on the source? Beyond, of course, if it says RT, we know that that's
yes. But it's not always that straightforward, right? Because Russia runs I mean, dozens and dozens of even overt channels, China even more than that. And so unless you're doing this work full time, you may not be aware of what these sources are and who they're connected to. One of the problems, as probably many are aware of, is this move away from fact checking by the social media platform. So back in January, as a way of currying favor with the new administration, Mark Zuckerberg announced that they were no longer doing fact checking in the United States. So they were going to stop supporting fact checkers. They were going to stop putting fact checks alongside posts on the platform. And so there was this push by the platforms after 2016 to really start funding professional fact checking. Now you've seen the opposite come into play, where they are cutting this, they're sort of aligning this kind of work with censorship. And so you're seeing, I mean, this is across the board. This is in my field, the fact checking field, this huge shrinking of funding. So that's problem number one. But there's still very good fact checkers out there. So it's always this effort to try to triangulate information by then going off platform, seeking out that information from a credible outlet, or seeing if a fact check has already been written. But of course, as I was sort of alluding to in the presentation, we know now that the Russians and others have tried to game that system by getting their own sort of faux fact checks to show up in spaces as well. So during the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, the day after, I think, they set up effectively a faux fact checking account on Telegram. War on Fakes, it was called. And War on Fakes was effectively a Russian effort to fact check all of these narratives about the war, some of which were actual falsehoods, planes taken out of context they were seeing. But then when there was the Bucha massacre, they used that veneer of credibility to try to debunk actual war crimes. So there are those who are out there who are trying to manipulate the fact-checking industry as well. I know this is getting away from the original question, which is how to actually use fact-checking to our advantage. I mean, I still just try to go to multiple different sources and try to triangulate it. And if it is something that is particularly noteworthy and it has not shown up in any credible outlet whatsoever, that's usually a time to pause. But the real issue is speed. I mean, things tend to still get fact checked. As you noted, we still have a robust media ecosystem in the US, and things like that pallet of brick stories, that gets a fact check. It doesn't get a fact check in the first hour or two, which is when those stories tend to go viral on social media. So it's a time issue. And so for people, I would just say slow down, obviously, give it some time to figure out if something is real or not, because fact checkers and media have had a chance to look into it, and don't spread it before you've been able to verify it.
Is this something, good fact checking, not manipulative, fake fact checking, fake fakes, something that's can be crowdsourced? Are there sort of people who do it as part of a team, but they're distributed and they're not sitting in a room somewhere. They don't need to be, but who are really good, and they're good online, and they're good at doing the kind of checking that you're a professional at. Maybe you'll be training some of them. And can that expand in a way that helps counter the Russian efforts to fake fact check or whatever they're up to? Is it already happening?
Yeah, there have been efforts. I mean, in the Baltics, the Lithuanian elves are an example. So these are people in their free time. There's no official organization they belong to, but it is sort of a loose confederation of people fighting Russian disinformation online. And so they've organized at some level to monitor their own information environment, which, granted, Lithuanian is a smaller language. It's a little bit easier, but to push back in a sort of crowdsourced way. Obviously, that's what X at some level is attempting to do through community notes. And as much as I have an issue with the direction that X has gone in the last couple of years, there are some elements of community notes that I think are worthwhile, that are good. And what community notes is effectively trying to do is, you need to have effectively two different, they're not fact checkers because they're not official, but two people who are part of this sort of community notes network who have disagreed on issues in the past agree on a certain community note for it to be shown. And so it's trying to build a little bit of community consensus from different points of view. around what is actually a legitimate fact check. The problem is that's been shown to be tough to scale. There isn't a lot of, well, there's no real recourse if the fact check proves to be inaccurate or wrong. And there's a little bit of a lack of professionalization. So I think there's good parts of it and bad parts of it. And Wikipedia is effectively the same thing, right? They've empowered this community of users to try to monitor their own spaces. I mean, we know there are problems with Wikipedia, of course, but there are elements that I think can be used effectively to try to counter this, because clearly we should not rely only on AI, although AI does have a role in countering some of the AI mis and disinformation that we see. But you need, I think, all three. You need the community organized around sort of informal fact checking. You need some AI tools. And then you do need, though, I think, still the professional fact checkers who have standards and have a certain criteria that they have to adhere to.
Let me quote briefly from your recent report on the manipulation of the disinformation from Chinese, Russian, and Iranian sources surrounding the immigration rates and those riots, those disorders, those protests. This is a quotation, Russian messengers further exploited the events in Los Angeles to attack democratic leaders and woke policy. Russian state media were quick to repeat criticism from members of the Trump administration, including from Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, accusing Democrats of creating an atmosphere of lawlessness and chaos and defending foreign flag-waving insurrectionists. He's the president. He's the vice president. They were willing or unwitting participants, maybe in this case, absolutely intentionally, in something that then, of course, the Russians, Chinese, Iranians could pick up and magnify without any distortion. I mean, in normal times, we want them to be quoting our elected leaders. So this is my last question. It's pointing back to the Trump administration, because a couple of the questions I hadn't got to are the same thing. Why are they doing this? Where might it be headed? And that's with reference to everything from the social media, removing fact checking, free speech above all, to the dismantling of these various units in different agencies that were countering cyber attacks, countering influence campaigns. I won't ask you again, what are they up to? I know it's complicated. What I want to ask instead is, do you hold out any hope that this will right itself, that when some maybe strange mix of motivations that include free market, that include big campaign donors, that include doing a favor for Xi Jinping and Putin, when some of this shakes out, that there'll be a correction to a more U.S. national interest, and we'll see some of that rebuilt, some of those efforts, restarted, and that this is just a temporary early administration kind of fumble.
I'm pessimistic in the short term. I want to be optimistic in the long term. I think one of the things that was disheartening about these early moves is look, I mean, we went through the first Trump administration. That's when we started our work. We had very good contacts with parts of the administration then. And, Russia was always a taboo topic for obvious reasons, but they understood the threat coming from China, from Iran, from others. And the fact that Iran had affected to infiltrate the Trump campaign, to hack documents, to leak it, to damage the Trump campaign, there was some hope that there would be parts of the administration that would understand the overall threat, even if they tried to downplay the Russian threat. That clearly hasn't happened. I mean, they've leaned just heavily in this direction, that all of this work is equated to censorship. This is a censorship industrial complex. And so I don't know how we break through that narrative. My optimism comes in is, I think fundamentally people don't like to be misled, and they don't want to be deceived. And as information systems continue to be run by artificial intelligence and powers that they kind of cannot see, it's not a journalist they can run into in a Starbucks, I think there will be a push to get back to a bit more of human-centered media and information. Because I don't think most people, regardless of the political spectrum they're on, are comfortable with the current information environment. I mean, they look at the other side as being the problem, of course, but I think everyone looks at AI, at sort of the algorithmic sorting of information, as being problematic. And so I do have some hope that we will get to a place of going back to more credible journalism, credible reporting, because I don't think people are comfortable with the current information system. Now, the problem in the current is the incentive structure for politicians and for the media to play into the digital ecosystem is really out of whack. So you are incentivized to be provocative, you're incentivized to spread mis and disinformation, and I don't see that getting fixed anytime soon. So when we talk about Ukraine and how politicians have affected perceptions on Ukraine, you know, you're talking about your students. What we found was, when we actually went through all members of Congress and their posts about Ukraine, this is a little dated, but the vast majority of them were supportive of Ukraine. The problem was the 100 most engaged with posts, the posts that got the most views, 98% of them were negative. And they came from 5 people. You could probably guess the 5. And so you've got this incentive structure that is really pushing information from a few people who are very vocal, but are not really representative even of their own parties. And I don't know how we right size that, at least in the near term.
Thank you. I've got to turn it back to Richard now. This has been fascinating, but I think we're under time pressure ourselves. So Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. English. And Brett, wow, this truly has been fascinating, as Dr. English mentioned. I'm really glad that at the end you gave at least some optimism towards the long term, because as you said, in the short term, it does seem rather dark. I mean, I'm really happy to know that you're doing the work you're doing. This has truly been insightful for all of us to understand the dynamics at work here, and to know that AI is in fact reinforcing and making it easier for these folks to do this kind of malevolent work, malign work that they're doing. I hope in the long term that AI will also help us to try and ferret these things out. And as you say, if we can do this in a more human-centered way, where we recognize and want to get the truth and not be fooled by some of this targeted information operations. But I go on, but it was just a fascinating conversation for me, and I'm sure Dr. English, you as well as our audience. And by the way, I want to thank you both for just a terrific session, and I want to thank our audience as well for the great questions and on this, because that really helped. I had some of those same questions as well. So, Brett, before I thank you both, finally, I want to remind our audience that we do have a great AI information panel tomorrow night. If you're interested, please attend. The link is there to register in the chat box. And also, the Los Angeles World Affairs Council presents these kinds of webinars for free, but we really depend on the help of our audience to support the work that we do, to allow us to do these kinds of webinars as well as the in-person events. So if you're in a position to do so, we really appreciate it. You can go to the chat. You'll see a link to donate to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, or you can go to our website. By the way, it's a brand new website. We just within this week switched over. So if you're interested, please go to our website. It's lawac.org. And there's a donate button. If you're in a position to do so, we would really appreciate your support. But finally, I want to thank Krista Seitz and Brianna Rue for helping to coordinate this webinar. But most of all, again, Brett and Dr. English, thank you so much for just an absolutely terrific and insightful session with us. We look forward to having you back, and hopefully to talk a little bit more about what we can do about it for the steps ahead. You've alerted us on what the dangers are. Now we need to talk about how we can act as a community and informed community to look at this. But again, with Dr. English in Italy, by the way, and Brett Schaefer in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for taking the time to bring this to our members in the community. It's really insightful. Thank you both very much. And you all have a great day, and have a great day to all of our audience members. Thank you very much.